Okay, so here is the new link in the chat.
Okay. Well, while we wait for everyone to trickle into the right YouTube chat, I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second session of the launch of Degrowth Strategy, how to bring about social ecological transformation. And before I introduce our brilliant panel, as we wait for the audience, I thought we could recap the first session, which happened last week, on strategizing for degrowth with and within diversity. So the common thread binding the book together is the anti-capitalist framework, for which the immortal Wisconsinite Eric Olin Wright is famous. And Noémie, as a member of the editorial team, could you briefly remind us what this framework consists of and how it was altered for the purpose of the book?
All right, so let's jump to the content. Maybe just by the Eric Olin Wright work has been our brilliant in her chat, and the basic Eric Olin, so upon
Noémie, I'm so sorry, you're breaking up a little bit on my end. Well, I'll come back to you with that.
You're muted, Charles.
Charles, I think you're muted. I'm sorry, my
sorry. Thank you. I was just saying that we'll come back to you, Noémie, as soon as as soon as we've introduced our panel. But now that the correct link has been posted, I'd like to welcome anyone who has just arrived. And today we're going to try to have a very concrete conversations on strategies for challenging corporate power. So I'm Charles Stevenson, and I'm studying degrowth through the Autonomous University in Barcelona, but I'm also an activist searching for a path out of our current interlocking crises. As we head next week into our 27th COP in Egypt, the latest United Nations Environment Programme emissions gap report found no credible path to our 1.5 degree climate target. And as Inger Andersen, its executive director, warned this week, we have had our chance to make incremental changes, but that time is over. Only a root and branch transformation of our economies and societies can save us from accelerating disaster. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Climate is just one facet. We could evoke femicide, neocolonialism, the global food crisis, the continued rise of the far right, energy, inflation, democracy, but our panel is far more qualified to do so. And while these crises in our capitalist system are complex, we feel that the role of corporations is far from anodyne. So to take the current lack of a comprehensive framework on the sixth mass extinction as an example, a report published last week on Influence Map found that 89% of engagement by leading industry associations in Europe and the US is designed to delay, dilute, and block progress on tackling the biodiversity crisis. For this reason, we decided to focus this session on corporate power because the Degrowth Scholarship has provided an irrefutable empirical diagnosis of our situation and a compelling pluriverse of visions for what our world could look like. But this book isn't about the what, it's about how we get there. And we wanted to celebrate today the fruition of a major collaboration for degrowth, and at the same time provide ideas for anyone who is thinking, okay, I recognize that our societies must be transformed. How do we do that? So we're joined by 4 fantastic scholars and activists in the field of social ecological transformation. Colleen Schneider, Mario Díaz Munoz, Tahir Latif, all of whom contributed chapters to part 2 of the book, as well as Noémie Cadieux, who has made this huge collaborative project come together as a member of the book's editorial team. Noémie and I were actually studying together at University College London before the pandemic, and we met through Extinction Rebellion Camden. She's a human geographer who has researched the potential for citizens' assemblies for climate and environmental policymaking. Noémie, let's try again. Could you tell us a little bit more about the project and discuss how you decided to structure the book in this way?
Charles. If you can't more. So sure of the it makes me think of not only dressed on the bits colors to so or the Degrowth has received a that it's the academic for the
Noémie, I'm so sorry, but we're still not hearing you. We're still not hearing you correctly. So while we wait for that connection to sort itself out, we're gonna head straight into a short introduction to each chapter by its respective author or co-author. Can I just confirm, given that I'm not sure which end the technical problem is on, that you can all hear me? All right. Okay, that's wonderful. So I'm going to follow here the chronology of the book, and in that vein, we're going to start with you, Mario. So Mario is a pre-doctoral researcher at the Department of Sustainability, Governance, and Methods of Module University in Vienna. His chapter provided an overview of strategies for social ecological transformation in the field of energy. Take it away, Mario.
Thank you very much, Charles. Yeah, it was Noémie, and it was a little bit scattered. She would maybe reconnect now. So first of all, I just want to say that to write this chapter was very complex. The topic is extremely wide. Energy in general is like, okay, like here we have, and strategies around energy are happening at all scales. The vast is extremely vast. So I really want to thank Noémie and Tony Smith. They were part of the editing process, and they really helped to put everything together with coherent bodies. It was actually very helpful. So I want to start just saying that the problem that we all know is that how energy systems are organized. The basic principles of the organization of energy systems at the moment are like basically kind of like a symbiotic relationship between like profit-oriented companies, transnational corporations, and like power-seeking states, which try to secure and control energy flows in order to gain this political comparative advantage. Okay, so that's kind of like all of that fossil fuel, of course. So we want to like what strategies could lead us to a low carbon, lower energy use, but also socially just and politically just kind of like energy system. So this chapter is kind of like a structure on the 3 pillars. The first one will be like the resisting and disrupting energy capital. The second one, building alternatives, and the third one, culturing low energy practices. So the first one, this resisting and disrupting energy capital, is around the question of like who produces energy and for what. Basically, as simple as that and as complicated as that. Resistant emerges when energy infrastructure projects intersect with environmental damage, territorial dispossession, global injustice. And this, I want to clarify that this is not only circumscribed to fossil fuels. This is increasingly happening more to like renewable energies with process of green extractivism rooted in colonial past, unequal exchange, etc. That whole chapter goes through the strategies that have a wide, vast range from like disobedience, blocking, civil resistance, but also from legal strategies like bringing companies to court, also like economic strategies, the divestment strategy. What I wanted to highlight here is like 3 ideas. First of all, is like there is a huge disparity in the consequences of this activism in the global north and the global south. It's not the same to do this kind of activism in the global north than in the global south. The second one is that there is a shift that brings some hope into the narrative of like, not in my backyard, that is shifting into a not in planet Earth. That is very hopeful and brings a lot of hope, because it's like, I don't care. I mean, of course I care about disrupting this that is happening right here, but also we're building transnational networks of action that recognize that because we are fighting against transnational corporations that can especially fix different things, our strategy should also take that into account and should also act on the transnational scale. That's the first thing that is resistant and it's like kind of like disrupting energy capital, very summarized, of course. Then we go into building alternatives, which is more, here we have to recognize that the problems with the economic system are not only about growth, but it's also about power, about the control of like resources, the control of flows, etc. So to put the zoom into ownership is crucial through this chapter. So basically the chapter goes through community energy projects that tackle the issue of ownership, that tackle the issue of who controls and for which reasons, how do we democratize. They try to embed into the discussions issues of energy democracy, energy sovereignty. Sometimes they do it not discussing about energy, but only discussing about how do we democratize our communities, how we democratize, how we are more sovereign around, how do we control our future more. And a concept that is key in this chapter is the matter of scale. Control happens at different scales, at the national level, at the municipal level. The competences are shared between institutions in a very, very, very complex way. It's context specific sometimes. And here it's very important to see what is going on at the national, how the national could help the municipal, how bottom-up strategies could shed some light into the discussion of what is going on at the national, etc. That interplay between scales here in this chapter is quite important. And there are strategies that go through citizen climate assemblies, public common partnerships as a counterbalance from public-private partnerships, and a variety of like community-based projects like that emerge basically. And the other one, the last one, will be like culturing low energy use practices, which is based or is more focused into strategies that pertain individual behavior. Here, I will put a caution label in a way that I think degrowth should engage into like individual actions. Yes, of course, because they are politically empowering and because it gives you some kind of political agency on your own life, of course. But at the same time, should embed these these individual things into practices. The actions of individuals right now, I'm in Cyprus, there is no public transport. The actions of individuals are embedded into a set of cultural and material practices that they cannot be detached. They have to be taken into account when talking about the strategies. Just to finalize and to kind of like stay within 5 minutes of the explanation of the chapter, kind of, or a little bit longer, I would say, I just want to like put like 4 lines, like 4 common threads between the strategies and energy systems. The first one is like, we have to build politically effective alliances through broad-based movements based on ideological diversity. Then recognizing that the main driver of mobilization can be different from energy concerns, can be based on sovereignty, can be based on other type of things. Bottom-up decentralization, yes, but always through a transnational web of action. And then the individual actions, as I said, yes, of course, they're welcome, but they should be embedded into this kind of like complex cultural and material practices that should be changed in the first place. So that's kind of like the overall description of the chapter. I hope I'm good in time. Thank you very much.
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Mario. It's wonderful to hear a presentation of the energy transition that puts so much emphasis on democratizing our energy system, and that feeds very well into the chapter that Tahir Latif wrote with Haliki Kreinen. So Tahir is secretary of the Greener Jobs Alliance in the UK. Their chapter pertained to an overview of strategies for social ecological transformation in the field of paid work, with a case study regarding just transition in the aviation sector, in which Tahir has most experience fighting for workers' rights.
Okay, well, thank you, Charles. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation to come and speak about this chapter. Yeah, as you say, in our chapter, really, we look at the options for the future of work and what work will look like, and if those options lend themselves to the social ecological transformation that we hope to achieve. I should say at the outset, I really like the fact that the book brings together important theoretical perspectives with practical campaigning and organising examples. Personally, I went straight to work from school and did my degree and master's later in life, in my 30s and 40s, at the same time that I was a trade union representative. So I don't say that makes my experience better or more valid than anyone else's, but working and living both theory and practice at the same time was quite a unique experience that has undoubtedly informed everything I've done ever since. In the same way, this chapter brought together the intellectual framework constructed by my co-author, Haliki Craning, who did a superb job, with the real life situation faced by aviation workers in the face of our multiple social crises. I think she had by far the harder task, since all I had to do really was describe what it is that workers in the industry are going through as it relates to climate and to the concept of degrowth, while she had to wrestle that material into the structure of interstitial, symbiotic and ruptural strategies provided by rights. But hopefully that happy collaboration is felt to have worked by those who have read the chapter. First, we introduced what should be obvious, that the current organisation of work is very much at the heart of the multiple social, economic and environmental crises that we face, even as it continues to be a key component in defining who we are as people. Equally obvious, a transformation of our society to achieve social and ecological justice requires a massive change in the world of work. As with other speakers, these changes are seen as a combination of rights strategies, specifically interstitial and symbiotic. In the chapter, we worked through the difficulties faced in redefining and reconceptualizing work. A three-part framework or categorization helped to think about what are the changes needed, or what are the changes that can be implemented. One is changing what work is actually done, which simply put means replacing environmentally destructive industries with low carbon ones, amongst other things. Second is to change the character of work, i.e. from exploitative, low-paid, measurement and GDP based to fulfilling well-paid and social justice based. And thirdly, transitioning to a more democratic workplace, eliminating hierarchies, utilising the skills and knowledge of workers, alternative models of ownership and democratic accountability, which are all things I think we'll probably come to further on in the discussion. Now, these don't necessarily map one for one to rights models, but we kind of like the idea of three-part categorizations. And they might be considered a kind of everyday expression of heading down a similar kind of pathway. Now, there are two issues in the chapter, which I'll pick up on further in the discussion, because I know we will have questions on these things. One is the danger of adopting strategies for change that work to save capitalism rather than transform it. And second, the critical role of withholding labour in galvanising change. I'll talk later of how the rail strikes in the UK this year represent a pivotal moment in that struggle. As an aviation worker, I was also asked to look in some depth at a report, of which I was a co-author, in fact, called A Green New Deal for Gatwick, which kind of plays out some of the issues that we describe in the chapter. The aviation industry obviously is a key player in the decarbonisation debate. When the COVID pandemic came along in 2020, it gave what I would describe as a foretaste of the impact of climate catastrophe. There was no flying and consequently no work for workers. And despite the existence of the furlough scheme, Gatwick Airport used the situation, some might say opportunistically, to lay off many thousands of workers. So unlike climate, at least so far, this was a sudden ending of employment for many workers and left a huge human resource effectively in limbo. The Green New Deal report is not rocket science. It simply analysed the needs of the local communities around the airport, including the shortage or absence of social and public services, degraded over 40 years of privatisation, and proposed where jobs were needed, who might be well suited to do them, and how much it would cost. Naturally, the jobs proposed were predominantly in non-profit making areas such as care, education, health, public transport, all areas woefully neglected over the previous decades. In terms of the bigger picture, this did raise an interesting question. What if we had similar plans for every town and city? And in fact, a couple of cities in the UK have actually adopted the same template to produce their own plans. Would a transformation emerge that was actually greater than the sum of the parts? In other words, would it become obvious that orienting our workforce towards what we might call a care economy rather than a growth-oriented one is actually better for the vast majority of people in every way, including equality, well-being, fulfillment, social cohesion, and so on? And is that an example of a true bottom-up approach to transforming the very basis on which we organise our society? Or is there a degree to which we're still dependent on electing governments that would enable that change rather than hinder it? And it's kind of open question, which again, we can discuss during the subsequent phase. So I think, Charles, I'll probably leave the description of the chapter there, and we can maybe unpick some of those issues during the general discussion. So thank you.
Well, you're very modest to hear, but I thought it was incredibly refreshing to hear a concrete example of what proposals for a just transition look like on the ground in Gatwick, and I'm excited to start the conversation. So for anyone joining us, you can post your comments in the chat section of the YouTube channel. First, though, we're going to hear from Colleen Schneider, who co-authored a chapter on strategies for social ecological transformation in the field of money and finance, with a case study of the Austrian Cooperative for the Common Good. Colleen is a PhD candidate at the Institute for Ecological Economics of Vienna's Wirtschaftsuniversität. Colleen, all yours.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. Yeah, very happy to join all of our speakers today. So this chapter came out of a session that my co-authors Louise Lankenfro and Ernest Agner and I had organized at the Vienna Degrowth Conference a couple of years back. And then Christina Buzko added our case study on the Austrian Cooperative for the Common Good. And it's really a pretty, I would say, a broad overview of intervention points for the monetary and financial system, because this is a expensive and broad system, yes. But we break it into the idea of democratizing, definancializing, and repurposing. So I'll try and go through a bit of what we cover there, and then we get into more detail where people are interested and have questions. But I would say first that we open the chapter with the understanding that money itself is a social relation, and the monetary system is always and necessarily both socially and politically embedded. And this understanding is key for understanding the capacity or the role of the monetary system in social ecological transformation. And as a part of this is the understanding that trust in money and the monetary system is enforced by public authorities. And in this way, money is fundamentally a public good and needs to be understood and operationalized as such. In terms of democratizing money, we talk about both how money is created and how it's spent. In terms of how it's created, we focus on the banking system. Over 90% of all money worldwide is created through the banking system. And in this way, a public banking system is really a crucial element in controlling the process of money creation and localizing and democratically embedding that process. And we argue that there's the necessity for a national or potentially supranational framework for environmental and social guidelines, some kind of public taxonomy in this way, but then within that, a local and regional system of banking to decentralize that process as well. In terms of how it's spent, we bring in the issue of people's budgets, also called participatory or public budgets. So now we're talking about directing flows of money. So in this way, targeting municipal budgets to operationalize money as public good. Yeah, then we move on to definancialization and connect the financial system itself to this idea of the commodification of everything. Yeah, and in this way, this is quite key to a degrowth strategy. Yeah, so financialization ties to for example, the primacy of liquidity and the short-termism of investment, which is quite important when we start thinking about sustainable production and investment in this way. We focus quite a bit on the need for strong regulation that has the capacity to curb financial innovation We point to how understanding the public backstop of the monetary system makes clear that we need to focus on banks and financial institutions that are small enough to fail, as opposed to what we saw in the Great Financial Crisis, this too big to fail logic. And in terms of financial regulation, I would say this also connects to the qualitative and quantitative limits on asset holdings of institutional cash pools. So there's really, checking the power of these large financial actors. We address also financial motives in the non-financial sector, which is a part of the broader shift towards financialization, and democratizing control and ownership of the structure of firms is a key point. In this is shifting away from the shareholder valuation model and towards cooperatives or public ownership. And then discuss the idea of definancializing everyday life via broader processes of decommodification. And connect here to the retreat of the welfare state being tied to the commodification of everyday life and these increasing levels of private debt that we've seen across nearly all high-income countries from the 80s onwards. And we tie this then into welfare systems designed under assumptions of perpetual economic growth, and specifically discuss the role of the pension system and the shift towards financialized pension systems, and contrast this to pay-as-you-go systems in the context of what this might mean for a degrowth transition. We then come to international finance and embed this within the understanding of the restrictions that free flows of capital in the global financial system necessarily put on domestic monetary autonomy and the capacity for domestic monetary policy, and how this is very much differentiated, for example, between global north and global south, or within this kind of currency hierarchy understanding or framework. And then in terms of redirecting and repurposing money in finance, we mentioned divestment, as Mario mentioned. Then we talk about the role of central banks and monetary policy and financial regulation. And so this could include, for example, greening asset purchase programs or greening central bank collateral frameworks. It also, here is important to understand that the role of central banks has historically been different than what it is now, right? They have historically used, in many cases, used a much broader range of tools than are employed today, including qualitative and quantitative credit regulations. And this is a really key point in terms of strategies. Because right now, credit is preferentially allocated to fossil fuel sectors due to its perceived and historic profitability, and that a targeted and democratically embedded approach to credit regulation would serve both as a complement to public investment, to direct private finance in line with the degrowth transition, and also to alleviate inflationary pressures from a planned reduction in economic activity, which is quite important, especially now in the context of the broader inflationary pressures we see. So we need to shift away from this very kind of narrow idea of interest rates as the tool of monetary policy, and take this broader perspective. And then we also discussed finally special purpose currencies, which I think is kind of the only interstitial strategy in terms of the Eric Olin Wright framework that we bring in. When we talk about this as a potential to move away from general purpose money and value commensurability towards a more differentiated understanding of value and localizing value creation and community building. So I'll leave it there. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Colleen. We have specific questions relating to each of your sectors, as well as the crossovers between them. So you mentioned divestment, and we're gonna get into that. But first, I wanted to take a step back and talk about the framework that you ended on, Colleen, which I think Noemi was trying to present to all of us, because really the thread that binds the book together is this anti-capitalist framework devised by the Wisconsinite Marxist Eric Olin Wright. And this framework relies on a series of modes of transformation as Wright understands them, and you were mentioning Colleen. So there is an interstitial level that acts in the spaces that have that are existing outside of capitalism, in which alternatives can be built up and apply pressure to the structure as a whole. There we could think, for example, to take an example from Mario of kind of community supported energy systems and initiatives like that. There's then a symbiotic mode of transformation in which we work within capitalist institutions in a way that redirects their initial aims. So a socialist government implementing, for example, a jobs guarantee would be a symbiotic strategy against an anti-capitalist symbiotic strategy. And then finally, we have ruptural modes of transformation, and right here relies very much on the revolutionary socialism of the 21st century, and actually dismisses that mode of transformation in his proposal for eroding capitalism. But the big shift from Wright in this book is that Katya Tchaikovskaya rehabilitates ruptural modes of transformation, and each of you in your own way argue for a multiplicity of strategies in each of your sectors. So for example, so Colleen, Louison, and Ernest argue that Wright's categories are ideal types, but in reality, strategies can have interstitial, symbiotic, and ruptural aspects within them. Mario points kind of to the interconnected, mutually dependent, context-specific nature of strategies and tactics. And Haliki and Tahir argue for a combination, an interaction of these, rather than being confined to a single approach. So the reason I bring all of this up is to ask, if we believe that degrowth should be embracing a multiplicity of strategies and tactics, what do we gain from sorting our various strategies into their respective categories? Isn't it rather academic for practitioners and activists on the ground to know whether what they're doing is interstitial as opposed to symbiotic or ruptural? And any of you can jump in on the value that you see in Wright's framework.
Well, shall I say something first? I think that in terms of what you described, Charles, that you know, the situations of the various industries that we covered, when it comes to practical action, you're not going to get kind of adherence to a particular mode. I mean, that's just not going to happen. You know, people will do things based on reaction to the circumstances that they face. But I do think there is a significant and important place for this kind of thinking and creating of frameworks, because it does provide the kind of conduit through which that action is actually funneled. I mean, you know, to put it very crudely, you could say, you know, how far would workers ever have risen up in any circumstances had Marx not conceptualized what a capitalist society looks like? You know, I mean, it's as basic as that. But I think without intellectual frameworks for how we do things, you know, how would they necessarily get done? What would actually happen? You know, you'd have a series of random actions. So I do think that planning and implementing a better future is a collective, collaborative effort, and it involves both the mind and the body. It involves physical workers and thinkers as well. So there's an importance to it in as much as it provides that kind of pathway to getting to the next steps. I'll leave it at that, I think.
Mario or Colleen, do you want to add to that? You don't have to. I think anyone should contribute to any question where they feel compelled to speak.
I think Tahir gave a great response.
Brilliant. In that case, we're going to go back to divestment, which you brought up, Colleen, but which is also present in your chapter, Maria. And both of you strike a rather unconvinced tone when we come to divestment campaigns. But I'd like for our audience who might not be divestment activists to take a step back and to introduce us to campaigns like $350. How is divestment supposed to work, and what are the limitations to it? Colleen, you want to start, given that you brought it up, or yeah? Yes,
certainly. So we do, as you said, we mentioned divestment in our chapter. So, I mean, this would be removing financial flows from, in this case, if we're talking about fossil fuel divestment, from companies directly or indirectly involved in fossil fuel use and extraction. And I think we do, as you said, take a somewhat unconvinced tone. I think it's actually worth thinking of divestment not necessarily as just an economic action, but really a broader, like a social action, as a kind of social movement that shapes public opinion and can also then potentially spur governments to more concrete legislative action. I think, particular institutions divesting from fossil fuel institutions isn't in and of itself necessarily going to have the effect of removing access to financing for those institutions, or it's not, right? There's other ways to access financing. But I think the divestment campaigns are important in that they are representative of a social movement that is representing a shift in public opinion, and that can drive broader change. So, it's in this way, can delegitimize the industry. And I think it's important to think of it in this framework rather than as a strictly economic tactic.
Yeah, I like that. Mario, go ahead.
I would totally agree. For me, it's more like a powerful gesture, but still a gesture of legitimation or delegitimation in this case. It's about it's basically saying I don't want to be associated with this. These people, these corporations are doing what I consider a crime to humanity. I do not want to be associated with them by sponsorship, by any economic ties, any reputational ties. I just don't want to be in the same room as these people sit down. And that's a reputation kind of action that you take. That's why I think maybe it's very powerful that every institution engaged with education removes themselves from these kind of actors. It's kind of it's a political decision, and it's a powerful one, but in the realms of legitimation, in the realms of reputation, moral even. But yeah.
Great. So what Gramsci might call building counter hegemony against big oil rather than actually stopping their financing. And I want to just stay in this industry, Mario, with you. Because if divestment isn't going to prevent companies like Shell from getting the financing they need, then at some point we still need a strategy to prevent them from digging up and selling as much hydrocarbon as they can find. And one of the things that you and I discussed in the lead up to this event was nationalization, of bringing these companies under public ownership and having a planned reduction in their production. So some of these companies are so powerful that it's hard to even conceptualize what bringing them under public ownership might look like. Could you run us through that? And if you feel that nationalization isn't the answer, then what is?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to bring to light one detail that is 2/3 of the oil reserves are in hands of state-owned companies, not private ones. Just to put things also in perspective sometimes, and then the argument pro or against nationalization will be in a proper functioning, in a proper market, properly regulated and properly functioning, the market does everything. The market allocates, it delivers the best prices and also fosters this efficiency and innovation. And someone pro nationalization, let's say, will say, well, the market fails, and this is a strategic asset, the energy, but also can happen with other ones, and we need to nationalize it to put it in the national interest. Here, I have my differences, not to the principle of it, but to the principle in the current context of it. And given the information that I gave in the beginning, 2/3 are already state-owned. So first, one strategy that could happen without the nationalization is basically what is happening right now after these obscene profits of the fossil fuel companies, like the tax in the windfalls, ban the buybacks because that's obscene, This is just obscene. And then nationalize the industry. Okay, we could go into nationalization of the industry, but then we should also, from a strategy point of view, kind of raise these questions of like, what is national interest? Like what we are seeing now, what national interest is, like it depends who is in power. So if we nationalize, then we also have to take the meanings of what national interest is, because otherwise we are shifting the problem from one side to the other. As I said in the beginning, if at the moment the energy systems are organized around profit making, but also power seeking, well, okay, this could be a problem. Maybe what we need is like scale this, and we need like public ownership to democratically own the assets, and then we collectively decide. If we assume that there is representativeness in the state, then okay, that's a direct yes. If we assume that there is not, then we need the representativeness to be able to collectively decide what we want to do with those assets, I would say.
Yeah, that seems like such an important point. Thank you to get the context of the kind of organization of petroleum exporting countries and the fact that so many reserves are actually already in national hands. That's a really good point. Thank you so much. And unless there are follow-up from the chat, which I will look at in just a minute. I first wanted to ask Tahir about the keynotes that he situates within our capitalist economy. You write that the centrality of work to meeting the fundamental needs of society means that workers' movements such as unions provide the most likely basis for successful society-wide struggle. You also see cooperation between workers and environmental movements as a key strategy when aiming to transform work. So this is very concrete, and so I'm going to ask you a very concrete question. Like I said in the introduction, I'm an environmental activist. Should I be convincing my comrades who have limited capacities to be spending their resources on transforming unions in a place like Switzerland, which is where I live? It's a fairly conservative place, like many others. It suffers from low union density and business unionism. Should this be an absolute priority?
Well, that particular question, I think it is a difficult one, because I think if we're building the links between, for example, trade unionists and climate activists, then those things will just happen naturally anyway. And hopefully that will galvanize workers into becoming union members, because they see it's more than just the immediate benefit of being a union member. It's also, there's a broader significance to it. So I think, when you talk about spending resources, of course, we are all kind of limited in what it is we're able to do. But I think mutual support and involvement in each other's campaigns is really important. And that's the thing that I wanted to kind of dwell on in terms of this particular question, because you're absolutely right, and maybe I'm just biased because I am a trade union representative, or I was. Is that I do see that as being the kind of the key lever by which we drive changes in our society. I think I went back to look at the beginning of the book actually earlier today in preparation for this meeting. I thought the first sentence pretty much summarised, even though it was written about probably a year ago or something like that, summarised where we are in 2022 with amazing accuracy, when it said that climate, rising inequality and COVID are not unfortunate coincidence, but the outcome of a system oriented towards perpetual growth and capital accumulation. Now, I think what's happened this year, and it's become crystal clear this year, these linkages, the rooting of our multiple crises in a single cause, I think that's been the defining breakthrough in 2022, is that more and more people are recognising that these are crises that have a common cause. People are suffering from one or more of them, but recognising that it's actually got its roots in a single cause also brings solidarity and hope, I think. Now, this is especially important in the UK, I think, where our government's response to the crises and its role in exacerbating them has been so much worse than anywhere else. It's not a crisis of the Conservative Party, but of a system that's exhausted its possibilities, I think. But what it has done is it's broken open the facade and removed the veneer of the system to expose our multiple struggles as one struggle, and thus bring people together. It's not that long ago that climate activists, for example, and trade unionists might be seen as antagonists because of mutually opposed interests. But right now we're seeing very clearly that workers, climate activists, local campaigners, scientists and theorists are grappling with a common cause, and it's been made blindingly obvious by the links between the energy and climate crises, rising cost of living, increasing inequalities of all kinds, the threat of war, the pandemic, and so on. For us in the UK, the key developments are, forgive me for kind of dwelling on this, Charles, realise much of the audience probably isn't in the UK, but the key development has undoubtedly been the rail strikes. After 40 years of lying dormant and oppressed under the weight of anti-trade union legislation, strike action strictly circumscribed, the rail unions have opened the doors for others to flood through. And how they've done that is, the significance of their approach can't really be overstated. Rather than a single industry, single employer dispute about pay, what the rail unions did was acknowledge that pay in a time of spiralling inflation is an issue for all workers, that all should join a union and take action. They didn't play the game of staying in their silo. That's inspired other unions to also take action and to raise the prospect of an autumn and winter of coordinated industrial action in defence of workers across all sectors. They've also gone, the rail union that is, has also gone to great lengths to reach out to local communities on the issues of their services, cuts in public services, and to climate activists in terms of the centrality of rail to a decarbonised transport system. So the seed of seeking a pay increase for one group of workers has galvanised not just the union movement, but all movements. And what they've demonstrated over this last summer is the sheer power to change things inherent in the act of withholding one's labour, something that can have a greater impact than marches and demonstrations alone, as much as we need those as well, because it is backed up by something tangible. Anyway, I do risk kind of going off into a bit of a rant there, so I'll kind of leave it with one final point, which is seeking an increase in pay in itself might be seen as playing into the prevailing agenda. What the triumph of the rail union is to parlay that into a broader call for social, economic and environmental justice. In other words, using the traditional pay negotiations route as a starting point for a whole series of actions emanating outwards from that initial call, which is a really interesting point when we think about some of the strategies put forward in this book. So I'll leave it there, Charles.
No, that's great. I think it was exciting for all of us, like you've been describing, to see groups like Just Stop Oil on picket lines with Railroad Workers United and building a common front with the Peace and Justice Project. So it's great to hear your experience there. And we've got several questions coming in from the chat to you, Colleen. So I'm gonna read out a few of them, and you can maybe weave an answer out of several of them. So first off, we have David asking, is degrowth possible with a money supply created through fractional reserve banking? If the money supply must grow, can production stabilize? Then we have Vienna asking, what is your take on whether there is a growth imperative in money creation as interest-bearing debt? And if so, how would you approach, what would your approach be to overcome this within a degrowth transformation? I had a few questions of my own, but maybe you can start off with those and see how we get on.
Yeah. Can I actually say something in response to hear quickly? Is this okay? First, I'm very happy to hear that you think there's this broader movement and understanding towards the symbiosis between trade unions and the climate movement, and that these really are orienting towards the same goals, or that the same strategies are important there. So it's happy to hear this. And it also, you discussing the demand for wages reminds me of, in the context of the monetary and financial system, this idea that price stability itself comes through a broader social compromise. Yeah? And this is, I think, something that's starting to be also more brought back into public consciousness in the cracks in this idea of central banking as this technocratic, apolitical, independent institution functioning just through, proper economic models, right? This idea that how we deal with price stability and the effect that has on the power of labor, these are obviously very political things. And I think this understanding is starting to shift since the great financial crisis, even though we have ended up back in this place where central banks are all hiking interest rates again in the last month or so. But this connection, I think, is, to me, I thought of this was connection about, the discussion of the demand for wage increases and the legitimacy of this and the importance of understanding this broader idea of price stability as coming through a broader social compromise. The question of fractional reserve banking. So for people that don't know, fractional reserve banking would be that so right now when banks make loans, this is the creation of new money. The idea of fractional reserve banking is that the quantity of money is fixed by the central bank, and commercial banks just then lend out deposits, right? So what they were kind of thought of as doing, although that was never actually what they did. So it's a cap on the quantity of money. I do not think that's necessary for degrowth. I think bank money creation and endogenous money creation more broadly is in and of itself not problematic, but it's important. The broader structure within which it sits matters, right? I think it's incredibly important that credit creation follows broader social goals and biophysical limits. And I think this comes through qualitative restrictions on credit creation. And there might be some places where it makes sense to put quantitative limits, but broadly, I think qualitatively shaping credit creation in line with social and ecological goals is what is necessary for a degrowth transition. On the question of the growth imperative, but I think there's good work by post-Keynesians showing that interest-bearing debt itself does not create a growth imperative. So in this way, there's not an accounting growth imperative for money. I think the growth imperative is more broad, like it's part of the kind of the institutional structure of the monetary system, and it's really actually tied to the monetary system we have now is kind of a product of the late 17th century changes that happened in the banking system in England, right? So it really, the modern monetary system and capitalism really co-developed. And this way, the growth imperatives of the two are tied to these changes in rather than money being this public good or tool of the sovereign, it being something that is something that is purely a commodity or is something that's controlled through private hands or wealthy investors that the state then needs to gain access to, right? Like Christine Deston talks about these changes being worse, like the idea of the benefit, like self-interest becomes baked into the monetary system. So I think it goes, I don't think there's an accounting growth imperative, but I think there's a deeper like structural institutional growth imperative with a monetary system that's very much tied up with growth imperatives of capitalism. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we're getting into very, very big debates within degrowth regarding the what, and this whole session is about the how. So we're gonna come back to strategy, and we have a very direct question in that regard from the Degrowth Collective, who asks, should politicians run on a degrowth agenda? And rather than we could talk about this for a long time, but could I get a one sentence answer from each of you on that? Yeah, sorry. Anyway, if anyone wants to start, go ahead.
I'll say yes, they should, but we have so many links in the chain from being able to make that a tenable proposition in terms of the general public that we probably need to think about ways of getting there rather than just doing it straight off.
That was a compound sentence, but I'll take it to here. Does anyone want to follow up?
The shortest sentence I will just say is yes. That's it. Like, but if you want something a little bit more, I would say yes. Again, the strategy again is like how to, in the current environment, having opposition, because parliamentary politics, like how do you deal with issues of security, scaremongering, structurally drivers that drives you into maybe unexpected things that will put you out of power in the next election. So like, yes, but with careful signs.
Also a compound sentence. Yes, with this connection to degrowth as a shift to a focus on well-being, right? And that kind of being central, because I think there is the public willingness to really take up and go along with that idea.
So building on that broader idea of messaging, Chris asked, can we, for instance, promise to replace bullshit jobs with a job guarantee, which I mentioned as the example of a symbiotic transformation, or does degrowth already focus too much on appealing to the professional managerial class as opposed to workers? Do any of you have an answer for Chris?
I would say I'm an enthusiastic proponent of a job guarantee, and this is actually quite an important part of building popular support for climate transition and making these linkages that Tahir talked about before. Maybe he wants to add more on this.
I'd say, yeah, a job guarantee is essential, but it has to be situated within a context of that I don't really hear a lot talked about when we talk about things like universal basic income, for example. What is the work we should be doing? You know, what is the work we need to do, and how much does that add up to? There seems to be a kind of an assumption that automation will affect your job, but it's the job you're doing at the moment. What's the work we really need to be doing? Why can we establish that first and then see where we are? In doing that, of course, we're kind of hitting on the issue of bullshit jobs anyway. And I tend to think that those are, and I know from personal and regrettable experience, that those tend to be based in the office rather than the physical jobs. But we need to think about it in the broader context of what work do we actually need as a society to actually get to where we want to go.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I guess perhaps staying with that theme of some of the policy proposals that have been coming from modern monetary theorists. I wanted to follow up with you, Colleen, on what you said about capitalization versus pay-as-you-go pension systems, because you argue that the former are incompatible with a degrowth transformation, and you argue instead for a latter as exists, for example, in Switzerland. So could you run us through the nuance between those two systems? And my follow-up question was, if we follow kind of modern monetary theorists and accept that in a country like Switzerland that has a pay-as-you-go system, the government could essentially have a UBI to complement the job guarantee that Tahir that you were both talking about. Could we just scrap pensions altogether and rely on some form of universal basic income for anyone who is unwilling or unable to work?
Yeah, so quickly, the capitalized pension system is often privatized, but not necessarily a pension system where the money you pay into your pension goes into financial markets. And the idea is that, this will deliver returns over time. You will get your money back in your pension through returns in financial markets. A pay-as-you-go pension scheme is where workers now pay in, and that money goes to people that are currently pensioners. And so both these rely on growth in different ways. The latter relies more on the demographic growth, and we're seeing a demographic shrinkage in many high-income countries. So this is problematic in terms of pay-go pension schemes, right? We make the argument in the chapter that capitalized or funded or these financialized pension schemes are inherently incompatible with the degrowth model, but the pay-go schemes potentially are compatible. And here I would bring in, kind of this MMT logic in that, you can resource domestic resources and including labor through domestic spending, and that there's the capacity for the state to offset the difference between what's being paid in by current workers and what is needed by pensioners. But I think, the key thing here is that I think it is actually quite important to understand that the financialized scheme really does rely on a continued growth of the financial sector and continued increase in returns. And there's movement in the last decades from pay-go to financialized pension schemes. And I think this is quite a hard thing to undo once it's been done. And it's really generally not thought of in the context of the implications for degrowth. So I think it's good that we bring this up. In terms of a UBI, one of the critiques of a UBI is that it can be used to justify stripping away existing welfare programs. And I think this is a very legitimate critique of a UBI. I think having this pay-go system that's offset by the state would be a better structure than a general UBI. But I also think a UBI is problematic, and that it's taking state spending, which has the capacity to move us away from financialization, towards decommodification through building out systems of universal basic services. But a UBI takes the alternate logic. The state can spend, and it can just spend in such a way that basic needs are still met through market mechanisms. So I have some hesitancy around the idea of taking this and shifting it towards a UBI in terms of a strategy.
Unless anyone wanted to add to that, I wanted to follow up on one final point from your chapter, Colleen, which was the potential for local currencies to catalyze a degrowth transformation, in which there's a lot of interest across the field, and specifically there was a paper in 2013 published by Christopher Dittmer that was very skeptical about the potential for local currencies in catalyzing purposive degrowth. And you bring up some examples and some examples of them in your chapter. Are there points that make you more optimistic?
I mentioned before that this is the only thing in our chapter that we really saw as an interstitial category in terms of money and finance, right? Like actually building something out outside of the existing system. And here I think it's important to understand the connection between the monetary system and sovereignty. Like money systems are generally national systems, sometimes supranational, and always embedded within and limited by the international system. And alternative, special purpose, local currencies are ways to try and, depending on how they're structured, create these pockets that operate outside of the delimitations of the broader systems. And Dittmer, has these categories for what they would necessarily need to be in line with degrowth, and kind of makes a critique that none meet all of these categories. But I think there's still validity and worth in these experiments. Like generally they are things that they are community-based. They are about building out solidarity, supporting communities, and they also are embedded within a broader understanding of money that I think is quite important outside of whatever effects the system might have. Understanding that the monetary system itself is a social creation, and that there's power to play with that and try and reshape that. That in and of itself is powerful, and I think important in the context of degrowth.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're back to kind of the value of political education, as opposed to maybe not as opposed to, but in addition to structural change. So building on that, I did just want to go back to the exchange we were having with Tahir, which pointed out that activists have limited capacities, and we can't do everything. And there are a lot of people who would like to take action, but don't know in which direction to to turn. And so I wanted to hear from each of you within your respective sectors. What is something that you think is absolutely non-negotiable and we need more resources for, and what is something that you think has maybe attracted too much attention and isn't really going to catalyze social ecological transformation? And Mario, you touched a little bit on the limitations of individual action in your introduction. So maybe you could start and cite something that you say, hey, we need more people here, and something that is maybe overhyped.
If I understood the question correctly, if we need more resources in a specific part, I don't know if I understood it correctly, like Charles, the question.
That was the way I was, yeah.
If we have to put like financial or like resources into something.
Financial or people power. I mean, yeah, pick your strategy.
Yeah. I'm a little bit like obsessed with this multi-scale kind of like thingy, because when I was, for example, in Barcelona, everything it's not that everything dependent, but everything was like multi-scale all the time. Like, so, for example, if you wanted to do something like ground bottom up, let's say, you were highly dependent on either the support of the people around you, but also the institutional support to some extent. There was some kind of like policy certainty, policy uncertainty. I will put my efforts, and this is a very difficult question, like, thank you, Charles. If I had to put my efforts into something related with the energy transition, I would try to put my efforts into developing public ownership of the structures themselves, because then you kind of like also, at the same time that we were saying before that you socialize the idea that fossil fuels are morally wrong and I don't want to be associated with. If you socialize the production and the consumption of the energy itself, maybe you also socialize the idea that solving the solution here doesn't mean could be a problem elsewhere. You socialize the idea that your solution here requires a solution elsewhere. It happened with COVID, it's happening with climate change. Whatever you do has to happen at both scale, and to have the control over the resources, over the structures, over how you produce and consume the energy. Maybe it gives you that perspective that then can be like socialized afterwards. Kind of like a half-baked answer, but like, okay, there you go.
Colleen or Tahir, do you have a specific point where you, within your sectors, that you think has a lot of promise and you'd like to see more people working on?
Yeah, I think for me it would be the concept of climate jobs, of the idea that there are more jobs involved in combating climate change than there are actually in destroying the climate. In fact, you know, just getting the heads of workers around the idea that actually your jobs are not at risk from making that transition. In fact, there will be more jobs and more work to be done in you know, doing the things that we need to do than there are otherwise. And I think the point about that is that it contains within it, if you can get the concept of a workforce that is oriented around the climate across to people, it contains within it the implications of public ownership, what Mario has talked about, because you think, well, how can you organise those things such that they work? And also de-emphasising growth as the key factor in your society. So I think that would be my first, the thing that I would direct effort to in the first instance, with the expectation that it would then lead on to those other things.
Brilliant. And Colleen, we've had a follow-up from David on your point about the importance of universal basic services. So maybe this is something you can weave into your answer. He asks what you're optimistic about and whether you see experiments around public transport, and maybe that's referring to the kind of like something like the €9 ticket in Germany as prefigurative.
Yeah, and this is where I wanted to go with your question anyway, Charles, because I think despite my defense of local currencies, I think really the the key point of focus, at least for high income nations, is fiscal spending, yeah, and orienting fiscal spending around the development of universal basic services, universal public services, right? So that we're decommodifying access for day-to-day needs. And I think in this way, like the Green New Deal, at least as its, its more progressive iterations are thought of in the US, for example, is a positive step in this direction. I do think some of what we've seen around access to public transit is also a step in this direction, right? So this understanding of the operational, again, coming back to this idea of operationalizing money as a public good, right? Money ultimately being backstopped through public authority and being really clear in the need to orient this in a degrowth transition, yeah? And again, I don't think this is, while this is top down, this can also be structured in a way that is, decentralized, democratically embedded. I would also add that a point that I think that is really important to enable greater monetary autonomy for lower income nations is debt jubilees. Or, for example, like the loss and damage facility that's being discussed at COP that was shut down last year and is being brought back up again now, or like these debt for climate swaps, right? The debt burden that falls on lower income nations is really, really handicaps their capacity. Yeah? I mean, they need to ultimately build out like food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and these things can't be done with this massive debt burden. So this is also I think a really key point.
I'm an activist with Debt for Climate, so a thrill to hear you bring it up. But I wanted to stay with the Green New Deal that you were highlighting in its more radical iterations, and this is something that you were talking about, Tahir, and so to quote from the end of your chapter, you write, such an approach could open up a number of possibilities, including replacing the profit motive, GDP and growth, as you were saying, with well-being as the primary measure of success, to enhancing workplace democracy and enhancing worker participation in implementing a socially just Green New Deal, which could alter the basis upon which work is carried out. This is a revolutionary project, indisputably, and implementing a Green New Deal in its more radical iterations means overcoming some of the most powerful corporate lobbies that the world has ever known. So my question for all of you is, can this be achieved through bottom-up organizing alone? Because there is a lot of focus on the bottom-up throughout the book, and very little on the role of the state and top-down. And some of you have touched on that in different ways. But I'd like to hear quite concretely, is bottom-up enough? And if not, what is needed in addition?
Well, since you mentioned the Gatwick Green New Deal, I'd say, firstly, let me say that it immediately provoked a response from Gatwick Airport, because, as you say, these are powerful lobbies. The aviation industry is a very powerful corporate lobby. It immediately provoked a response in the sense of a report that told about all the wonderful things that Gatwick does and how crucial it is to the local economy. This really, this did make me laugh, actually, because it was predicated around the premise that Gatwick is embedded in the local community. And my response to that was, that's exactly the problem. That's not the solution, that's the problem, is that we're overly dependent on this single employer and the entire area. If there's an issue with that employer, then the entire area becomes, collapses into unemployment and poverty. But nevertheless, their ability to get that message across, you have to be constantly, and I think this does speak to your point, Charles, about is bottom up enough, is that at the bottom, our powers and our capacities are so limited that you have to be constantly working to try and offset something that corporations can do just like that, in the sense of putting out material and propaganda and so on. And so it is a really uphill struggle. And I think you would be extremely, you'd be you would get a great amount of support if you did have more of a conducive government at the top. So if you think about it, one of the things in our country about Jeremy Corbyn is not that he has this enormous knowledge of either the environment or degrowth or any other issue. His importance is in opening a door. Actually, he has the levers of power, can open the door, and you can rush through that door and do those things. It's about giving permission. And while I'm a great believer that the movement should be bottom up, worker-led, community-led, etc., nevertheless, having that ability to open that door is in the world we're living in today is absolutely crucial and helps enormously.
I can jump in, because it is enough to be bottom up. I would say definitely not. Absolutely not. I'm a strong believer in seeing what let's say the counterforce that we're trying to counterbalance is doing. And they're basically, I'm going to put this very bluntly because I personally really believe it, like they're socializing in spaces and being educated through class divisions to be part of the state, to be high judges, to be people who are running corporations. We can see this, it's like a whole elite capture that is socializing in the same spaces, in the same clubs, and they're trained all their lives to be high position managers, but also in key positions of the state. Whereas at the same time, other type of people is very comfortable saying that we are academics and activists, but very uncomfortable for some reason to say like we are academics and also potentially administration workers. We don't socialize, and we do not share those ideas between us, and we neglect, by definition, almost these positions of power. I really disagree with that. I think like bottom up, of course, but we should also socialize and we should foster between our circles to get those positions of power as well, to reach positions in the administration of the states as well. Of course, why not? I mean, at the end, they're like very, very, very powerful against or setting up regulation to stop. Who can raise taxes but the state? Who can take windfall taxes but the state? Like if we socialize in spaces that do not take into account that reality, whereas at the same time you have other groups of people that do actually do the opposite and do actually take that interstitial, like that symbiotic approach, and they really go, they follow their own strategies as well. They have that. So I think it would be silly to left them all the space. While we only focus on one or two, we should focus in all of them in the same way that they do.
Aggressive institutional capture. Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Mario and Tahir that yeah, we have to work at this from both sides. Yeah, of course. Like if we think about large public policy initiatives, again, like the Green New Deal, I think it's really important that the logic behind this, if I come back to your question about checking the power of large corporations or large financial institutions, yeah. Right now, there's a lot of rhetoric, but also policy in place that is undergirded by the logic of the role of the state is to incentivize and de-risk private finance to make investment in sustainable development, the green transition, more rosy, right? Make it more profitable, make it less risky. And we really like the logic we need to take is entirely different. Yeah, that the state has the capacity to drive these changes directly through public spending, and then also needs to take a strong regulatory role in terms of private finance. And so this has to come from this. Yeah, we're talking about top-down policies here, right? We're talking about national and supranational regulation and fiscal spending. So yeah, that's my comment on this.
Yeah, I love hearing aggressive institutional capture on a Degrowth panel. And maybe this is something we can we can stay with, because as I was saying in the introduction, the rehabilitation of ruptural change is one of the innovations of this book, of pointing out that ruptures are an unavoidable unavoidable part of our futures, and as the ecological and social crises worsen, we're seeing them with increased frequency. So if this is a theme that's very much taken up among a kind of a section of the literature that define themselves as ecological Leninists, and I don't know if you've engaged with people like Andreas Malm and Tahir and Jody Dean, but I think it fits in very nicely with a renewed thinking of ruptural change in the way we don't find within the classical Eric Olin Wright framework. So if we're thinking about kind of aggressive institutional capture at a time of ruptures, what kind of bodies do we need to be consolidated, and do we need to be building to be in place to take advantage of those ruptures? So Tahir, you spoke about the coalitions that are getting built in the UK. What do we need? What do we need to be thinking about here? What do we need more of? Sorry, that was quite a wide ranging question, but if any of you have thoughts on whether it's party politics versus militant trade unionism versus something else that we're not thinking about.
Well, I'll say briefly, it's not, I don't even know if it's necessarily relevant to your question, Charles, but one of the demands that we're making, as the climate movement is making, and in terms of public ownership, is not just the public ownership of utilities and energy and so on, transport, but also of the creation of a national climate service. That's one of our demands in the UK. It's for, we have the National Health Service to provide, supposedly to provide healthcare for our population, but we're demanding a national climate service which would coordinate and oversee and would be run, but in the public interest, to make sure that those climate initiatives are undertaken. So that's a kind of key governmental institution that just simply doesn't exist at the moment, that we think should exist to make those things happen. So that's something that we're looking for.
And for my part, coming at this from the money and finance side, and we think of institutional capture, my head, of course, goes to central banking, and the huge shift we've seen in central banking from the great financial crisis onwards, and them playing this role of what Tooze refers to as economic crisis fighters. And this is really interesting in this current moment of inflation, right, where you have central bankers admitting that they have no coherent theory of inflation. So then what other ideas are out there? How do we actually understand this? And how do we understand our capacity to deal with it? And this is where I think it's actually quite interesting to think about what MMT has contributed to this discussion and this kind of differentiated, heterogeneous understanding of inflation and the potential tools for dealing with it, and the kind of the popular uptake and in some cases like political uptake this has had. And so I think there's the potential for a shift there that is, in part pushed by a stronger, these crises presenting the space for more heterodox academic ideas to push forward, but then also this connection, again, with policy and social movements that are pushing for these more progressive ideas and progressive ways of understanding money and price stability.
I would say, yes, from the energy point of view, we are going through the energy crisis at the moment, and the responses, the institutional responses of this are all based on energy security and paradoxically, well, not paradoxically, but maybe highly expected, an onshoring of mining on behalf of United States, but also the European Commission, bringing mining home in order to secure the supply chains because they do not trust the disruptions in the supply. So they're bringing money home, mining home. Like Ireland, Spain have like, they recently had like 500 licenses open for exploration of mining within. So the development of like mobilizations that keep an eye on, we don't want the mining here, but also we don't want it elsewhere. And the only solution to that is to reduce our socio-metabolic corridor, to reduce our like levels of production and consumption. That's the only way possible to continue. Maybe these experiences of like, oh, we really do not want what is happening, will mobilize a little bit of like the only way to go, really, like, because, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to give each of you the time for closing comments, kind of 1 to 2 minutes max. Any remaining thoughts that you might have, and it's been great to hear you draw lines and commonalities between your different sectors, because as we've been talking about, this is we all agree the future of the fight. So if there any more of those, I think that's a nice note to end on. How can we be combining our struggles and finding common ground? And I'll give each of you a couple minutes, and Tahir, maybe you'd like to start us off.
Thanks. Yeah, well, firstly, can I thank you, Charles, for an excellently chaired session, and really interesting and loads of great ideas. And I think the point that I was going to close on really was that well, I'll make 2 points. The other one's very brief, but the main point was that you asked a question much earlier in this session about what's the value of doing these things if it's categorizing, and if the real world is going to do something else, then why do we do that? And I think the value really of these kind of exercises and books like the Degrowth and Strategy book are demonstrated in forums like this. I mean, look at this, at the end of an hour and a half, the amount of good ideas that have been bounced around, not only between people on the panel, but also in the chat as I'm reading through them, kind of answers its own question, really. What's the value? Well, the value is in generating those ideas and sparking those ideas. The other point I was going to make very quickly is absolutely Degrowth Collective sounds like a general strike would achieve both the slowdown of production and immediate challenge to hegemony. Absolutely agree with that. A general strike is kind of unspoken aim of certainly in the UK of the labour movement in the situation that we're in now. I think the climate movement would also be right behind that. And thanks again.
Colleen or Mario, either.
I can jump in. I mean, I think the two key things that stand out to me that really unite what all three of us are talking about is this focus on, building out universal basic services, right? Using the fiscal capacity of the state to develop universal basic services, which would include decarbonized forms of transport that are, universally publicly accessible. And the role of a job guarantee, right? To really solidify this this idea that the trade unions and climate activists are on the same page, and we have the capacity to ensure that this is done in a way that is really serves the people that would otherwise be harmed from the downscaling of particular sectors, right? And that there's the capacity to reorient towards like care and repair focused sectors. Not that that's a simple transition, but the capacity is there, and I think those are really key tools.
Yeah, from my point of view, I want to agree with Tahir a lot, because like only the book itself, the process of doing the book and discussing about the book is already like something very valuable, something like very like, I mean, the whole process itself is already like changes oneself. So that's very, very nice. And I also want to say something that maybe has nothing to do with energy, but more with strategy, like, which is like, I think right now, even we have seen it here, but like different people have different perspectives to what strategy should be taken, how we should go about it, which paths of a strategy we should follow. So conflict is going to emerge, and I will just ask to keep in mind always something that's not that present in this kind of like conversations, which is like to be care of the other, to have care for the other, like we are all in the same thing. If we do not agree with the strategy that the other person or the other community or the other collective is following, to try to understand them first, to try to have this kind of like care perspective and try to live up to the expectations of the moment, and try to not to cut social ties with those collectives, because at the end we are trying to do the same thing, and it's very important that that cohesion, even if only in a performative level, exists. It's very important not to cut up ties and to foment, to promote this kind of like environment, because then in there we can do nice things, I think. Like,
what a beautiful note to end on. We're still getting more questions and comments from the chat. Elsa really liked your multi-scalar approach, and I can only encourage all of you to seek out the book, which was published under a Creative Commons license. It's incredibly rich in the way that you've gotten a taste for tonight, and in the way that our brilliant panelists have described. I want to thank each of you, Mario, Colleen, Tahir, for your effervescence of ideas and ways of concretely fighting the social ecological crises we face today. Thank you to Degrowth Vienna for making this all come together, and to Degrowth Talks for hosting us. Thank you, Lena, for all your wonderful care work behind the scenes. And I just wanted to close in a very similar note to Mario with a quote from Mike Davis, who sadly passed away last week, as it can sometimes feel that the task ahead of us is immense, but I hope that tonight gave you some ideas for where to go from here. And Mike said that what keeps us going ultimately is our love for each other and our refusal to bow our heads to accept the verdict, however all-powerful it seems. It's what ordinary people have to do. We have to love each other. We have to defend each other. We have to fight. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. And I look forward to keeping these conversations going and taking action with you all in the future. Have a great night. Take care.